Hello, everyone. This is a new session of the Mediators talk at Beverly Hills Bars Association. I'm Carina Tăutu, your host, and I'm delighted to have as a guest Douglas Noll. He's a legend in the mediation world, but I'm going to read a short bio so everybody is up to speed with us. Douglas E. Noll is an award-winning lawyer mediator who has mediated thousands of conflicts. His calling is to serve humanity, and he executes his calling at many levels. He's an award-winning author of 3 books, a teacher, speaker, and a trainer. And his 4th book, De-Escalate, was published by Beyond Worlds Publishing in September 2017. De-Escalate is now in 4 languages, and it's in second printing. Doug's work carries him from international work to helping people resolve deep interpersonal and ideological conflicts. He's the co-founder of Prison of Peace and creator of the Noll Effect labeling system. And in 2012, Doug was honored by the California Lawyer magazine as California Attorney of the Year. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you for having me, Carina.
How are you doing and where are you?
I live in rural California in the central Sierra Nevada, about 60 miles south of Yosemite National Park and about 45 miles west of Kings Canyon National Park.
Does that help with peacemaking?
Well, it's lovely. I've got 10 acres with my wife. We have high-speed internet, and I don't have to deal with any of the problems of urban living. So it's lovely.
That's wonderful. Thank you for joining us. And to be honest, I think your last book is amazing, but I'm fascinated by your 3rd book, which is Elusive Peace. As a mediator and as a Romanian born, for me, like international conflict is something that I feel like we don't talk enough. And you're extraordinary in that regard. And for me, like, you covered basically the Afghanistan situation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Uruguay-Argentine, even the Kenyan 2007-2008 conflict. You made case studies of it. I have to say that I read the book, and at one point I was thinking of all this, like, case studies, and at one point I was like, did he resolve that? It felt so real. Like, I was like, wait, no, it was a case study. So I would like to ask you, first of all, how you came to write this book. What was the inspiration behind, and what is your calling into peacemaking?
I really didn't intend to write a book about a critique of international diplomacy, but I read a book called The Real Truth About Camp David. And it was written by a guy who was present through all the Clinton Camp David talks with the Israelis and the Palestinians, Abbas and Netanyahu. And they were very close to getting a deal done, and Clinton blew it big time. He made every rookie mistake a mediator can make. And I got to thinking about that, and I'd done a lot of international studies, work in my master's degree. I'd studied a lot of international conflicts. And so I went out and did some quick research to find out how successful international mediators were in resolving conflicts. And the statistics were stunning. The United Nations has a 4% settlement rate.
4%?
4%. The biggest, I think it was the Organization of African States, I think that's the one it was. It actually had an 18% rate. But you got to consider the source too. It might be a little suspicious. But no international diplomatic organization of any kind, whether it was a state like the United States or another country, or an international organization, or even an NGO, had a settlement rate where they got successful peace, successful agreements that were durable and enforceable and held, of more than 20%.
That is shocking.
It's shocking. And when we think about commercial mediation, which is very different, of course,
yeah.
But in commercial mediation, we know that if you just bring people into a room and the third person, who we would call a mediator, doesn't even know what they're doing, there's a 75% chance the case is going to settle just by the fact that there's a third person in the room. And when you have a skilled mediator in the room, the likelihood of settlement goes up into the high 90s. And so I got really curious, wondering, are diplomatic problems so complex that mediation won't work with them? Or are they so incompetent that because they don't know what they're doing, that they're just blowing it? And the conclusion I drew was the latter. I studied conflict after conflict after conflict. And in every single case, I saw a 17th century diplomatic technology being applied to a 21st century problem, which would, of course, result in utter failure.
That was what attracted me the most in the book. The title of we use this old technology, basically, and old mentality to solve 21st century problems. And in business, we know about 15 years now, right? There is this concept of blue ocean strategy versus the red ocean strategy. It's cooperation versus competition. They're starting to shift. And when I entered Pepperdine in the master's degree, I think the first question that I had entering law school as an artist was that, wait a second, why don't we have peacemaking, the most important thing? Why don't we have a Department of Peace? I'm not the first one to say that. And why don't we see peacemaking as a money-making enterprise? It's always this association that peace, there's no money in peace, right?
There is no money in peace.
Yeah, I think
there is no money in peace. Where do you want me to start? I mean, the list
please.
So why all this is true?
Yes.
It starts off fundamentally that we are, at least Western culture, and I can't speak to Asian culture so much, but I can say that Western culture is premised on a lie that's been perpetrated for 4,000 years, and that is that human beings are rational beings.
Yes.
And it goes way earlier than Plato, but it recapitulates itself in Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, and then fast forward, it got embedded into the Catholic Church through Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, as he constructed the Catholic theology. And he was the one that invented the doctrine of original sin, by the way. That isn't something that came out of Scripture. And fast forward into the 18th and 19th centuries with different strands of philosophy, everyone basically saying what makes humans different than other species is rationality. Utterly false. Utterly false. Neuroscience has proven in the last 20 years that what makes humans human are our emotions. We're the only species that have emotions. No other animals have emotions other than humans. And we have a small bit of rationality that under certain limited circumstances can help us solve problems. So that's the first problem. And the whole diplomatic effort based on the Treaty of Westphalia back in the 14th century, 15th century, is all based on this idea of a nation state being with a head, being the head of state, that's where the head of state came from, who's got a rational brain and is interested in self-interest. So it's all based on this idea that nations headed by kings and sovereigns will act in their own rational self-interest. Totally false. And we know this from experience, and yet the whole diplomatic effort is based on an assumption of rationality that doesn't exist. And so when heads of state or non-state organizations act in an irrational way, diplomats throw up their hands and say, oh, they're irrational, there's nothing we can do. I mean, it's totally wrong. So that's our first problem. The second problem is, of course, as we both commented on a moment ago, there's no money in peace. When I was writing about all of this, I learned that, for example, the media has no interest in covering peace. It's boring, it's tedious, it's painstaking, and of course it's utterly confidential if it's done the right way. So
it's not dramatic. There's no drama.
There's no drama. There's zero drama. There's zero there to put eyeballs on the paper, or on these days, eyeballs on the screen. Mm-hmm. So, and the third thing is that much more money is built constructing the machine of war than is made deconstructing the machine of war and investing in peace. even though all the statistics show that when you have a peaceful environment over a sustained period of time, wealth increases across the society dramatically. But wealth is not aggregated quickly in the hands of a few who are highly motivated to see war so they can sell arms and so forth. And then you get, of course, into the fact that most people are emotionally incompetent. They don't know how to deal with conflict. They don't know how to negotiate. And this includes diplomats as well as everybody else. And they have no training in this to speak of. And there's no surprise that none of this works. And
Yeah.
it's all utter failure for the most part.
That's very unfortunate, and it's always surprising. Of course, there are all these interests behind. I mean, in politics, it's so complicated. But one thing that I find that you're nailing so well is this difference between emotional intelligence and emotional competence.
Right.
Of course, it's a question: how do you get the real mediators to act and be active in this type of conflicts? It's so much to talk about it. But then I would like you to talk a little bit about, like in the case of Clinton, and you mentioned the failure happened because I think emotional competence was not there, not necessarily the intelligence.
Right.
It's not. Yeah. What's the difference, and how do you work with this, and
Right.
how can
So
we?
emotional intelligence is a form of social intelligence. And the concept was devised by Meyer and Salovey back in the early 1990s. And they were studying the idea of different kinds of social intelligences. And they came up with the idea that emotional intelligence might be a form of measurable social intelligence. So they devised what's now known as the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, the MSET, which is sort of the gold standard for testing this kind of intelligence, which is called emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman, who is a PhD himself and formerly trained as a psychologist, was the New York Times science writer. And he found out about their work and wrote a book that came out, I think, in 1995 that was a bestseller, Why EQ, or Emotional Intelligence, is More Important Than Regular Intelligence. And he has since built a whole industry around the idea of how you can increase your emotional intelligence, even though there is zero science to support any of his work. And when you look at the academic literature, the academics look at Goleman and just shake their heads and say, here's a guy who's just, he's just rubbing coins between his legs, cashing it in on pseudoscience. And when you go out on the internet and type in emotional intelligence training, in the first 10 pages, you'll find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who claim to be teaching emotional intelligence. And one, they can't even define what emotional intelligence is, other than some very broad categories. Two, they don't even define what emotions are. They don't know what the difference is between affect and emotion. And the people they claim to be training emotional intelligence have no specific training around the scientific concepts of emotion and affect, and stuff like interoception, the science behind all this. So it's all pseudoscience. But what Goleman does do, which we have to give him credit for, he does talk about emotional competency. And really, all emotional intelligence does is it measures the level of emotional competence that we have developed. So emotional intelligence is a test that you can't learn, just like I can't teach you IQ. I can't raise your intelligence by teaching you the IQ test, right? But you can learn emotional competency. And if you increase your emotional competency skills, you will tend to raise your scores on emotional intelligence assessments, and that's the difference. So our focus should be on developing emotional competence. Forget emotional intelligence. It's a word that just should be thrown out of our vocabulary. Emotional intelligence consists of three basic skills. How emotionally self-aware are you? How well can you regulate your emotions? And how well can you read and reflect the emotions of other people? And when you can do all three of those well, you are emotionally competent. You're an emotionally mature human being. And sadly, most people are not. Sadly, most people are emotionally very immature. And that's because 96% of all families are emotionally dysfunctional. And parents who don't know any better push the dysfunction down into the next generation by their own behaviors and raise adults who get emotionally stuck at 6 or 7 years old. They never grow out of the 6-year-old. They're in adult bodies, but at an emotional level, they have the sophistication and skill of a 6-year-old. And so if we cycle back to elusive peace and the International Diplomatic Corps, those people, they're human beings too. They grew up in dysfunctional families, every single one of them. Loving families, no doubt. Some more affluent than others, but at an emotional level, dysfunctional. And as a result of that, they carry into adulthood and carry into their careers all of the problems of emotional immaturity. And when you're dealing with a diplomatic dispute or an international dispute, which are very complex and very difficult, you can't be emotionally immature. You have to have a high level of emotional competency to be able to work with the dysfunction that caused that conflict that you're trying to work with in the first place.
It was very interesting when I think you said it repeatedly throughout the book, that this is not kumbaya, that you have to, it's a slow process. It's something that takes time. It's not going to happen immediately. You cannot push people into getting results under pressure. And a lot of the old ways, a lot of the diplomats are using power to get these deals done. And you can justify some of them because, unfortunately, I think we always go into a peacemaking process or a deal when we kind of blew it big time. It's like in medicine, very little preventive care is taken care.
For me, the issue is not whether or not we can get a deal done. The issue is this a durable agreement? Is this an agreement that's going to last for a while? Yes. And you can make people sign documents at a gunpoint, but how durable are those agreements going to be? And are they durable enough to win the hearts and minds of the population on all sides of a conflict, so that they would rather live with this agreement than live with war? And that's really the gold standard of a durable peace agreement.
And that's why you need a professional mediator.
That's why you need either need a professional mediator, or you need to have whoever is going to be doing the work extensively trained by professional mediators on how to understand and intervene in difficult, complex conflicts.
I want to make a case actually for this, that the mediators need to be out there. Like, in a way, that's why I'm doing this work.
I don't think your ordinary run-of-the-mill mediator has the skill set to do this.
Well, of course.
And the other problem, of course, is that the mediator, whoever the mediator or mediators are, have to be culturally appropriate for the conflict.
Yes.
So it takes a very special person with a lot of experience and training, and a lot of training, to be very good at this. And unfortunately, I'm not aware of anybody who's like that. I can't give you a name of somebody who says, oh, look at this person, very skillful, very knowledgeable, totally up on the literature, can practice the skills, and is effective in the field. I just don't know of anybody who's that way right now. I don't know of anybody who's ever been that way.
I mean, we need practice in order to develop these people, I guess.
It's a combination of having the theoretical knowledge and the academic knowledge, coupled with having the skill base, coupled with having practical experience. And all three of those build a mediator up to a place where he or she can be effective when called into a conflict to resolve. And there just are very, very few people, if any. I'm sure there must be some out there. I can't say that there aren't any. I just don't know of any who can do that. So the ordinary run-of-the-mill commercial or community mediator, without a lot more training, would be inappropriate for handling these kinds of things. But what I do argue for in Elusive Peace is that we should professionalize mediation as a skill level in diplomatic work, so that diplomats can go through formal training and have formal training, formal coaching, peer review, experience, and feedback as professional mediators, not as diplomats. That's what I argue for.
Yes, and I was impressed by how you handled like the Kenyan conflict, and that's one of the examples is like it's so beautifully done. Like you really need those skills, even if you're culturally tuned in, even if you're knowledgeable about the ethnic actually discrepancies.
Right.
It still didn't work. So it's so much. It's such a complex, like you have to be aware of like emotional competence, like neuroscience, to actually be able to hold space. You were telling at one point, and you're writing in the book, you have to hold space for the parties, and
Right.
it's a lot of pressure on you, right?
Right.
To have that. But it's not just like the reputation of someone like Kofi Annan, right? This is what I see a lot, right? Even in commercial mediation, we ask for people who are older or who have a name in the world. I have to say, I've seen younger students in the program who have extraordinary skills. Extraordinary skills. Of course, they need experience. It's a whole discussion about that. But to have the opportunity to exercise it and to actually trust that they're going to be good, it's an interesting process that I feel we're also not discussing.
We've seen this in mediation for a long, long time. So, for example, there are a large in commercial mediation. There are many, 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 many lawyers who would prefer to have a retired judge who has never taken an hour of formal mediation training to a lawyer or a non-lawyer who's got a graduate degree and has had thousands of hours of training and even tens of thousands of hours of experience. And they'd rather have a retired judge than have the non-judge pro do the work. We see the same thing in the diplomatic world, where mediators would rather have a name, such as Kofi Annan or any number of other people who were either former heads of state or heads of NGOs, or have some sort of notoriety about them that gives them star power, even though they don't have an ounce of skills. And the reason for that is people seem to think that if you bring in somebody with notoriety, celebrity status, star power, that somehow they're going to be able to pull out magic fairy dust out of their pockets and sprinkle it over everybody, and the conflict's going to get resolved just because they are who they are. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that's utterly, utterly false. It's a myth.
So what's the solution that you see? Because it's been a while since you wrote that book, but what do you think right now, what would be needed?
Well, there are 4 or 5 universities in the United States that train people to enter the diplomatic service. And the first thing we need to do is make sure that in their curriculums, they have tracks for people who want to become diplomats to learn how to be conflict resolvers. I'm sure they have some basic courses, but I'm also sure that they don't have any significant training on how to deal with conflict. And of course, that covers a whole vast area of study. But that's the first thing, is start working on the people coming up and get them trained. The second thing to do is as they get them into places where they can observe conflict and analyze it, and then hopefully as they begin to mature and get some gray hair, so they will be respected as elders, even if they're in their 40s, that people will begin to recognize the value of having somebody who has knowledge, experience, and the charisma to help people resolve conflict. That's what it's going to take, and it's going to take an ending of the hubris of the International Diplomatic Corps thinking that they can solve the world problems when, yeah, they're valuable. They're essential to have, but just because you're good at doing a trade agreement doesn't mean that you can figure out how to demilitarize a civil war.
And as you said, to have a long-lasting peace, because this thing
make a durable peace. And sometimes, durable peace, a lot of times, the success or failure of an international peacemaking effort is a lot about timing. And it's a lot about the parties, who's interested in resolving peace? Are they looking at it as a stopgap to give them time to rearm for the losing party? And, how, the question of creating safety and protection and enforceability becomes a real issue. And since we have a very weak United Nations as a peacekeeping force, there's a lot of issues over how you protect people from a violation of the agreement. And it's complex. Let's not, and it's all grounded in tribalism, ethnicity, ethnical battles, religious battles, ideological battles, and they are. It's not as cut and dried as a litigated dispute where it's really all about in many cases it's all about the money. So it's much more complex and much more nuanced, and so it takes a lot longer. It requires a lot more patience.
I'm going back to my point that actually was your point, that media is paying attention to the drama more than to the process of peace. And I know there is an issue of confidentiality, but I wonder from your perspective, how can we actually bring more attention to the peacemaking process? And I would say even the mediators. I have friends who are younger, and they said, "Oh, without knowing you, I've never heard of a
Right.
mediator."
Well, this is you ask a really difficult question that I have struggled with for many, many years, and that is, how do you market mediation? How do you market peace? And the fact of the matter, I've learned this: when you are in a peaceful state, the idea of peacemaking is lovely. What a wonderful idea! I can't tell you how many talks I've given over the years, and somebody comes up to me at the end of the talk and said, "Gee, that was a wonderful talk. I wish I'd known you 3 years ago when I was fighting over my parents' estate with my 3 brothers."
Well,
And I think about how many hundreds of thousands of dollars I spent on marketing, and it just didn't register. And then what I learned was, when you get into conflict with somebody and you're in a big fight and it's intense and it's emotional, your ability to think clearly about what you want, what is appropriate, peacemaking, for example, goes out the window. And all you want to do, at least in civil cases, is hire the meanest junkyard lawyer you can find to make the other side hurt because you want vengeance, one of the 6 needs of justice. And so you don't even think about the idea of peace. In fact, the idea of peace or negotiation or compromise is antithetic to you, because to you it feels like you're giving up or you're compromising on a sacred value or something that's really important to you. And people don't realize, because people have been brought up in an adversarial world where it's win-lose, not, if I help you satisfy your needs and you help me satisfy my needs, we'll both come out ahead. We don't grow up, we don't have that kind of world. We're bombarded with this idea of competition. And competition in some contexts is really a lot of fun. It's fun to watch a football game. Competition is good. But if you say, try analogizing the business world to competition, the analogy falls flat on its face and doesn't work. And yet, everybody thinks that competition is good. And they get into this social Darwinism that Spencer promoted back after Darwin first published his first book called Social Darwinism, that justified the aristocracy of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, on the grounds that we're just smarter than you are. We're more socially evolved than you are, all the rest of you little people. Mm. And that was this advent of social Darwinism, which persists today. I mean, all you have to do is look at the political polarization, the white supremacy movement that sort of burst out. And it's all social Darwinism. It's all saying white people are superior to everybody else. How dare you, brown and black people and Asian people, assert that you were equal to us? No way. So
it's interesting because I'm Romanian, and I immigrated in my late 20s, and there are cultural differences, and one of the things are it's very litigious here. It's very litigious. I think my people are kind of goofs of the Balkans, I would call them. They're a little bit, it doesn't mean that I think everybody, when it comes down to money or survival, they're going to fight with their teeth, and try to kill the other side, more or less. But the system is not so prone to battle, I would say, at least not the legal system, because you have to have a lot of money to do that. It's not here. You also have to have a lot of money, but I think it became very aggressive, I would say. And when I entered the law school as a mediator / former artist, it was pretty shocking to say, oh, apologizing. Half of the class who were lawyers were like, that's impossible. And we were like, what do you mean? Of course you can apologize. But I think it's a shift in culture, which in a way I see it in the young people. And on film sets, for example, younger people are easily collaborative, I would say, than people over 40. It's kind of a shocking thing to say or to witness, but it's true. And I don't know, what do you think it needs in the culture to kind of permeate this idea that you need to sit down, check in with your emotions, and try to find a deal that's not going to kill the other?
There was an interesting psychological experiment done a few years ago, and the researchers brought in a bunch of 20 and 30 somethings and put them all in a waiting room. And they gave them instructions to kind of get to know everybody in the room, because the experiment was going to involve some social testing. And they'd videotape what happened. And what do you think happened? Everybody pulled out their phone, and they didn't even text each other. They just right on their phone and started texting their friends and completely ignored each other. And if they had to communicate with each other, they would text back and forth across the room and not talk.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
And if people in their 20s, 30s, and even in their 40s are afraid to sit down and have a hard conversation with anybody, including their spouse or their partner or their children or their parents or their coworkers or their boss, they're afraid to have a hard conversation because they have never learned how to do that. They're not taught in their families, 96% emotionally dysfunctional. And our formal education is all based on training the so-called rational approach, teaching what is known as the task-focused system of the brain, not the default mode part of the brain, which involves our socializing. And so we are not formally trained how to listen and how to communicate with each other. We're supposed to learn this stuff. It's supposed to come to us. Nobody really will tell you how, but we're just assumed to have these skills, when in fact they are skills that they're just the same kind of skills as learning how to hit a tennis ball. You've got to learn the skill, practice it in order to master it. And they're not intuitive, and they're not innate, and yet our culture has this assumption that, oh, of course you have to be a good communicator, and then doesn't spend a dime on, well, what does that really mean? And how do we really teach that? And how do we measure good communication? And how do we know when communication has gone dysfunctional? Nobody talks about this stuff. I mean, communication theorists do, but outside of academia, nobody talks about this stuff. It's just not part of our thinking.
You're one of the practitioners. You taught peacemaking in prisons. And I know one of the things that stayed again in my head from Elusive Peace is that you said, if I can teach inmates to be peaceful and to actually teach others to do this, it's definitely a proof that we can also be effective on a diplomatic level. We can teach others at a higher level, but we can also teach it in school, correct?
That's correct. If I can teach people serving life sentences and long-termers in maximum security prisons to be effective peacemakers and mediators, and teach them how to train other inmates to be that way, imagine what I could do for you.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The outside world's not interested. I was called into a school district, a large school district, one of the largest in California. as it was adopting a restorative practices approach to discipline. And I was just basically started with one high school, trained all the teachers how to listen to other people into existence, my basic listening skills. And then I went and taught all the teachers in the middle schools that fed into that high school. I got more emails from teachers saying, this is the most amazing stuff I've ever learned in my life. When are you coming back? And it took me about 6 months to do all the training. Never heard from the school district again. Never, not a word. Despite the fact that I was getting got amazing results.
So who do we need
Schools
to
are
reach
they
out?
have no interest in this. They have zero interest in this. To them, socio-emotional training is a check the box kind of deal. And they bring in some person who's got no skill, no training, no nothing, except that somehow they can say, well, look, I can teach you people SEL. And they come in and what they teach is garbage. Now they check the box. Okay, we've taught our teachers how to teach SEL. And of course, nothing changes. I shake my head at it. I mean, to me, it's unbelievable, but it's what it is.
I mean, that's what I wanted to say this. Where can we go? Where can we put this discussion? And to whom should we address it? To bring people more into this awareness of how important the skills are.
So, Carina, where I've come out on all this, now that I've been living for a long time, I'm 70 years old, almost 71, is that I've decided not to try to change organizations and institutions unless they're really committed to changing, which is very rare. Where I can make a difference is one person at a time. So when I go into a prison with my trainers or with Laurel Kaufer, my colleague and partner and dear friend, and together we created this monster called Prison of Peace. But if we go and walk into a prison, I'm just committed to changing the lives of the inmates that are in front of me right there, whether it be 20, 30, 40, 50, it doesn't matter. That's all I care about. How can I help them grow and change and be effective peacemakers and mediators? And when I teach them how to do this, and then I teach them how to teach, I know that for every inmate I reach, the ripple effect will be thousands and tens of thousands of other people. When you start thinking about inmates that are going to get trained, families that are affected, friends that are affected, I mean, the ripple effect is huge. But there's no institution here that's supporting this. It's just a couple of people, Laurel and Doug, going out and saying, how can we make a difference? How can we help people be effective peacemakers and mediators? And that's what makes the difference. And today my training is all about, I'll go into corporations, of course, and organizations and teach this stuff, but nobody wants to invest the money that it takes to really learn and master it. They want the 1 day or 1 hour or 3 hour virtual workshop and, show us what you got. And 2 days later, they forget it all.
One of the shocks that I have, like doing more and more research on this, is that everybody talks about emotional intelligence. Nobody wants to actually do it. And and they talk about self-development, but when it comes to group dynamics, it's a disaster because we have results.
There are reasons for that. One, there are very few people who are competent to do this work, to teach, because they haven't done their own work. And in emotional intelligence especially, there are very few people who you can have a serious conversation with about emotional intelligence where they really understand the science behind it. They have had very little formal training. They're told what it is, and they tell people what to do, but they don't tell people how to do it. Well, all you have to do is regulate your emotions. Okay, well, how do you do that? Take a deep breath. Getting yes, go out on the balcony, take a deep breath. Well, okay, so that's a strategy if you've got a lot of time, but right now you're in the moment, and you got two people who are about ready to pull out knives and kill each other, like in a prison. I'm sorry, stepping out on the balcony is not going to work. You got to have something right now that's going to work right now. What do I do? And how do I do it? Yeah. And you asked emotional intelligence trainers, well, what would you do? Run! Call the guards! Nothing I can do. Man, sorry, I give up on those people.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit like individual development. You want to develop, you're will going to develop, and hopefully more people are going to watch you. And that's one of the reasons I hope, like I'm doing this. But I wrote your bio and I read it out loud here, and you said it's a calling to be a mediator. And I just want to wrap it out because I would love to talk forever with you. Now, like, I just started to be warmed up, but we have to keep it short. And I think, and I hope you're going to come back to talk more about these things with us. But you said it's a calling, right, to be a mediator, and I totally believe that. And I think, one of my teachers said at one point, it's like yeast. You sprinkle it, and like bread kind of sprouts. You cannot really teach it properly. You have to get it from someone, right? By being in the present and kind of getting out there. As you said, it spreads, but you have to have the sprouts. How did you get into, like, when was the moment for you? Like, this is my calling. What clicked?
Well, it was a long journey from while I was a trial lawyer to actually deciding that I didn't want to be a trial lawyer anymore, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I learned about a new master's degree program at Fresno Pacific, the Master's in Peacemaking and Conflict Studies. And I enrolled in that program. And it was actually the very first week that in my first course is when I all of a sudden realized what I was being taught was what was missing from the law. And I said, this is really cool stuff. And no wonder people hate lawyers, and that's when I realized that I could serve more people in a month as a mediator, a peacemaker, a problem solver than I would ever helped people in a full 30 or 40 year career as a trial lawyer. And that's really what made this shift for me. In fact, it's a funny story. After that first week, I went back to my law office where I was a senior partner and the second highest earner in the firm. And I went into our firm administrator's office and I said, John, I need some new business cards. He said, oh, sure, I'll get some for you. And I said, no. And it said Douglas, it had the name of the firm and all the typical fancy business. We don't have business cards anymore, but in those days, this is what it was. And underneath it said attorney at law. I said, Peacemaker. I'd scratched out with the blue ink. I'd put out attorney at law, but Peacemaker. And he looked at it and he turned white. Ash, I can't do that. And that's when I knew I was going in the right direction.
Wow. That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. Before I want to direct people where they can find you more, I have this usual rapid fire questions that I want to kind of energize the end of this.
Sure.
So let's try. Emotional intelligence is?
It is a test of emotional competence.
Emotional competence is?
A set of social skills that must be learned, are not innate, and are not taught in families, that basically teach emotional self-awareness, emotional self-regulation, and the ability to read and reflect back the emotions of other people, cognitive and affective empathy.
Why is peacemaking important?
Well, as Gandhi said, if we stick to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we'll soon have a blind, toothless world.
What will make peace non-elusive?
Say that again?
What will make peace non-elusive?
Non-elusive.
My accent always plays that trick.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me reflect on that just for a moment. These days, I think that if we really want to find peace and make it non-elusive, we have to completely change the way we think about human nature and human behavior. As I said earlier, we're 98% emotional and 2% rational. As long as we hold on to this idea of rationality, the myth of rationality, or the lie of rationality, then we're going to continue to judge and criticize people who are emotional as irrational. And when we start to recognize and get the insight that we are truly emotional beings and not rational beings, then we look at people who are different from us. We can begin to understand the differences emotionally. And it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense why they're doing what they're doing. And while we may not agree with them, we may even have to be in conflict with them, the way to peace is to validate their emotional experience and take them for who they are, where they are, which allows a higher likelihood of finding common ground upon which there can be reconciliation or relationships can be rebuilt.
That's amazing. And last question, have you ever done a mistake again and again as a mediator, or is there still something that you feel like, I shouldn't do this? And what's the biggest lesson that you learn and you feel like, it's the hardest one?
Well, if you want, the biggest mistake I make as a mediator is that I don't suffer fools gladly. And if some lawyer comes into a mediation with a case that's $25,000 dripping wet, or it's a no liability case at all, and says, I'm demanding $2 million and the other side's going to get hit for punitive damages, I just look at that guy and I say, you got to be kidding me. And I'll say that, I said, you're ridiculous. I'll call it right out. I won't be nice at all. I said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Your case isn't worth shit. You're lucky to get out with defense costs. Now, there are a lot of people who would criticize that approach, but I don't play nice like that. If somebody's coming in like that, they don't deserve my respect, and they're not going to get it. And people get really angry with me when I do that. Well, you're not being very neutral. I said, I'm telling you the truth, and if you don't get it, then you really shouldn't be practicing law, because you're taking up resources that you shouldn't be taking up. Your client doesn't have a claim. Get over it. Bring me a case where at least there's something to argue about. Nothing here. That's my weakness. I tell people the truth, and I tell it hard, and I tell it fast, and the mediation might be over in an hour, and I don't care. I'll give them their money back. I don't care. But they're not going to waste my time.
Integrity, that's another subject I would like to talk to you about, but at the later time. I kind of like that approach. I think truth and integrity, they have to be kind of hand in hand. But
I've got a lot of colleagues who disagree with me. I'm not Mr. Nice Guy when I'm up against somebody who's an idiot.
I think mediation is an art, and we have to respect that.
Right.
It comes with. Doug, thank you so much for doing this. I really hope to have you back and talk some more. Where can people find more about your work, where they can reach out to you? Hopefully some they will.
That's pretty easy. You can always Google me, but my email address is doug@dougnoll.com, DOUGNOLL.com. I'm a sole practitioner, solopreneur. I don't have any staff. I don't have an entourage. I don't work for any organization. I answer all my own emails. And my website, of course, is dougnoll.com. And if you go there, there are tons of resources, and all my online courses are available on the website. So if you want to learn how to become emotionally competent, I have an online course for that. If you want to learn advanced legal negotiation, the most advanced legal negotiation course in the world, that's available. If you want to learn how to de-escalate an angry person, that's available on the website. So lots of resources, and lots, of course, 50 or 60 or 70 articles on all these different topics that are absolutely free. And
you have a YouTube channel that I
have a YouTube channel with lots of videos that explain all this stuff. Just YouTube Douglas Noll, and that'll pop up.
He's amazing. And thank you. Thank you so much for this. And we would love to have you back. And
anytime, just send me an invite.
Thank you.